This is the breakout season. This is the season I'm gonna give it my all. Looking for offers, going to camps. I'm getting recruited, scouted, playing against high-level competition, and just being that outstanding player. Everything was going good. I just know if I had more time to play, I was going to have more than 6 offers.
The pandemic brought high school sports to a grinding halt, leaving many student athletes wondering whether they'll still be able to earn a scholarship and play in college. Some are counting on that scholarship to help them afford a college education.
I was relying on getting some more academic scholarships and on a baseball scholarship to help pay for college. But once baseball stopped becoming the option and we were out of school and the scholarships started scoring down, I knew I wasn't going to have the funds at the end of the year to be able to apply for college.
Student athletes looking to land one of those scholarships go through an intense recruiting process that traditionally involves meeting with coaches in person, but that isn't an option now.
Typically, the spring and summer months are prime recruiting times where college coaches are traveling to these camps and tournaments and recruiting events to watch kids play, and that hasn't been happening.
The NCAA told us that there are restrictions on recruiting until at least the end of August. Division I is in a dead period, restricting all in-person contact, and Division II is in a quiet period, where coaches can meet recruits but not watch them compete in person. Now, players are turning to social media and other online platforms to show recruiters their skills.
Biggest thing I was doing through the pandemic was I would record myself working out and post it on Twitter and trying to get noticed through there because I know that's a big platform for a lot of college coaches.
Digital recruiting is a part of the normal recruiting process. What's really changed is that now it's the only form of recruiting.
But many players feel that coaches and recruiters need to meet them in person to see how much they've improved.
Recruiting-wise, it has hurt me quite a bit because I haven't been able to get in front of the coaches that I'm interested in the schools and show them how much progress I've made this offseason.
For some people like me to pass the, that doesn't necessarily pass the eye test on a paper that isn't 6'8", you have to kind of maybe see a guard play in person sometimes, and that's something that's kind of been holding us back, or even be able to play, period.
In some places, it's unclear when or even if students will get back on the field. Some states, like Oregon, where the JARAMILLO family lives, have decided to postpone fall sports to the spring, a decision that has the family considering moving so he can play football somewhere else.
Bailey absolutely loves his teammates, and he's bummed that he might have to leave to go somewhere he's never been before, but structurally he has to do it that way.
For recent graduates like Devin, losing the opportunity to play for a scholarship has implications beyond the game.
We had gotten the eviction notice on March 2nd. My mom tried to hide it from us for a little bit because she don't just want us worried about it. She wants us to stay focused on school and what we got going on. But this time, I guess it was nothing she could do. So she finally told us we had to pack our stuff, and from that, we was homeless after that. I reached out to Coach CJ and Coach Kelly trying to get help. We talked a lot about how college isn't an option anymore. Things we can do. They started trying to help us with housing, shelters, but yeah, we got evicted. Currently, still homeless, still looking for housing.
For now, coaches are encouraging current players to focus on what they can control.
The biggest thing is train and prepare. There is going to come a time where it's going to be safe for us to play, and we're pushing for that moment. And when the opportunity comes, be prepared to seize it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.